The headlines: the U.S. formally begins withdrawing its remaining troops from Afghanistan to end what President Biden had described as a forever war. India reports a record daily rise of over 400,000 coronavirus cases as the country begins its inoculation drive amid shortages of vaccines. And the UN expresses concern over Bahrain's use of force against a peaceful sit-in in one of its jails after the death of a political prisoner. Well, welcome to our studios here in the capital, Teheran. Thanks for joining us. The United States has formally begun withdrawing its remaining troops from Afghanistan. American helicopters were seen flying over Kabul and nearby Bagram Air Base as Washington geared up the pullout process. U.S. officials also confirmed the troop withdrawal, saying that May 1st is just a continuation. American forces were scheduled to leave by May the 1st under a deal signed between the Taliban and the administration of former U.S. President Donald Trump. The Taliban accuses Washington of violating the agreement. However, incumbent President Joe Biden has promised to end what he called the forever war. He has declared all troops will be out of Afghanistan by September. The U.S. invaded the country in 2001 with its so-called war on terror slogan, but despite 2 decades of its presence, the U.S. failed to quell violence and ensure security in the war-torn country. Amin Alami says the U.S. troop withdrawal will leave the Taliban without the slogan of fighting foreign occupiers that they used to justify their attacks.
It seems that with the withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan, there will be no place for many issues or slogans for the Taliban, mainly for jihad, because there would be no foreign invader or there would be no foreign occupier. That is why the Afghan government and mainly the people of Afghanistan call on the Taliban to say yes to the demands of the people, that is bringing peace and stability via launching a direct negotiations between the main local players.
India set yet another global record in its daily coronavirus cases, registering more than 400,000 infections as hospitals are running out of beds, oxygen, and vaccines. The Federal Health Ministry also reported a record 3,500 plus fatalities in the past 24 hours, bringing the country's total death toll to over 211,000. The Asian nation has seen an alarming rise in cases and deaths since mid-April. Its total caseload now stands at over 19 million, second only to the United States. On Saturday, the country expanded its vaccination drive to all adults, despite many states reporting to be running out of stocks. Until now, only frontline workers like medical staff, people over 45, and those with existing illnesses have been inoculated. Hospitals and healthcare facilities have been overwhelmed with patients. Our New Delhi correspondent Monavar Zaman says the vaccination pullout or rollout is not well managed and has drawn large-scale criticism of the government.
The vaccination drive that was rolled out has completely failed because the vaccination was not rolled out in a proper or in a well-managed or well-mannered way, because there were lots of gaps and lots of issues with the vaccination drive. When the government said that they will start vaccinating a certain age group of people and the frontline workers, etc., it has drawn a large-scale criticism, because if we remember, when the country started vaccinating its population, it also started exporting the vaccination, which many believe was the biggest setback the country is facing right now. Well, last October, when the country thought that the virus is retreating, they started thinking that we will be the first nation to export vaccination to most of the countries. But what is right now the biggest trouble and the biggest challenge for the government is the vaccination, because they don't have the vaccine shots right now. Till now, only 9% of the population has been vaccinated.
As India grapples with COVID-19 crisis, Kashmir has also seen an unprecedented surge in COVID cases, prompting authorities to impose a lockdown in the region. Saif Ali Safi has more in the following report from the Indian-controlled Kashmir.
In the middle of the holy month of Ramadan, the historic Jama Mosque in Srinagar, the capital city of Indian-administered Kashmir, wears a deserted look. So are the other religious places across the region. Amid rapid surge in COVID cases, the religious bodies here have suspended congregational prayers and other religious gatherings.
We should understand the present situation. We request everyone to offer prayers at home instead of going to mosques. In this holy month, let's all pray for those affected by this virus and for an end to the pandemic.
Authorities in Kashmir have imposed lockdown to curb a surge in COVID infections and deaths. The announcement to impose lockdown came after the region recorded 700% increase in active COVID infections in this month alone, sending the alarm bells ringing. Officials have already banned gathering of more than 4 people, but essential services have been exempted from the lockdown. Authorities claim that there is no shortage of oxygen, medicines and COVID vaccine in the region, saying the government is handling the COVID situation effectively. But some people blame authorities for their late response to the pandemic.
There was no robust system of testing at the airport, at the Srinagar airport. And the biggest problem in our case was that the government and the administration here threw open Tulip Garden and organized other Khelo programs, mass gatherings, fashion shows. So this was to showcase normalcy. And in the process, what happened that from 50 odd cases per day, now we are here where we have more than 3,000 cases on a daily basis. And there are 30 plus deaths.
India, the world's second most populous nation, remains in deep crisis as hospitals and morgues are overwhelmed by the pandemic, with medicine and oxygen in short supply and strict limits on movement imposed in the country's largest cities.
The second wave of COVID-19 pandemic is causing a steep rise in the number of infections and posing a huge challenge for health experts and the government here. Experts have warned that the fight against the pandemic is far from over and have urged the people not to drop their guard against the deadly virus. Sayyid Safir, Indian-administered Kashmir.
The United Nations has once again called for the restoration of democracy and an end to violence in Myanmar. In a statement, the UN Security Council urged the release of all, including Myanmar's de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who were detained after the February military coup. The statement followed a warning by the UN Special Envoy about the deteriorating situation in Myanmar. Christine Schreiner-Bergner expressed concerns over the resurgence of ethnic fighting, hunger, poverty, and difficulties in consolidating power. Last week, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, also called for dialogue aimed at ending the crisis. Myanmar has been in a political turmoil since the military takeover of power. Concerns grow over the junta's intensified crackdown on protesters demanding the return of civilian rule. The UN Human Rights Office says that it is disturbed by Bahraini police's use of force against a peaceful sit-in in the kingdom's main prison. The spokesperson of the organization called the violent repression in the notorious Jao prison unnecessary and misappropriate. She called on the Bahraini government to immediately launch a thorough and effective investigation into the incident. Prisoners started their sit-in on April 5 after the death of a political prisoner who was reportedly denied timely access to essential health care. Activists say the security forces used heavy-handed tactic against prisoners, beating and injuring them. The Bahraini regime faces criticism over the situation of its prisons amid the coronavirus crisis. The appalling prison situation has also sparked protests among the families of the detainees. Palestinians have held a mass rally in the besieged Gaza Strip to voice their support for ongoing protests in the occupied West Bank and condemn the Israeli crackdown on Palestinians. Ruby Akram reports from Gaza.
Thousands of Palestinians took to the streets in the Gaza Strip after the Friday prayers in solidarity with Jerusalem Al-Quds and its people. The Hamas movement organized a mass rally. The protesters slammed the acts of violence done by Israeli forces in Jerusalem Al-Quds and expressed solidarity with Palestinians in the occupied territories.
Jerusalem Al-Quds has always been our main cause of conflict and the destination of all the resistance and revolutions. We will not accept the Israeli regime's attempts to Judaize Al-Quds by expelling and killing its people and demolishing their houses. Al-Quds is known for its brave men and women.
We are here to stress on our support to protesters in Jerusalem Al-Quds and Al-Aqsa Mosque and to tell them that we are here feeling what they feel and we will be all gathered to liberate Palestine and Jerusalem Al-Quds. I call on the international community to stand by our people in Al-Aqsa and support them against the inhumane Israeli regime.
The mass rally in Gaza, which occurred for a second Friday in a row, was triggered by Israeli restrictions on Palestinian worshippers in Al-Aqsa Mosque and the regime's crackdown on protesters against the restrictions. The protesters in the Gaza Strip vowed not to remain silent to the Israeli aggression against their brothers and sisters.
This is a message to our people in Jerusalem al-Quds that we will keep supporting and defending you against the Israeli occupation. We won't sit idle until seeing Al-Aqsa free and raising the flags of Palestine in al-Quds. We are all united on the road of resistance against this occupation.
Palestinians consider resistance as the only way to respond to all Israeli violations and the key to liberating the occupied Palestinian territories.
People here in the Gaza Strip stress on their support to Palestinians in the holy city of Jerusalem al-Quds. They say they are ready to sacrifice themselves in order to defend the integrity of Palestine. Ruba Shabet, Gaza.
The U.S. National Security Advisor says the Vienna talks and the revival of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal are in, quote, an unclear place. Jake Sullivan's comments came as Iran and the remaining signatories to the deal are set to hold another round of talks in the Austrian capital. Sullivan said that all sides, including Iran, have shown serious willingness to take a pathway back into the deal. However, he said it is still uncertain whether the process culminates in an agreement. Representatives of Iran, Britain, China, France, Germany, Russia, and the EU have already held 3 rounds of talks. Tehran has repeatedly said that it would only accept the outcome of the talks once Washington removes all sanctions in a verifiable manner. Iran also says that it will not allow the negotiations to become attritional. Top European Union officials slam Russia and threaten to take countermeasures after Moscow imposed entry sanctions on 8 EU officials. The heads of the European Council, Commission, and Parliament said that they condemned the sanctions in the strongest possible terms. The EU chiefs said the entry bans are unacceptable and entirely groundless. Moscow announced the measure on Friday, retaliation for the EU's bans on 4 senior Russian officials. The travel bans target the head of the European Parliament and the Vice President of the European Commission, among others. Tensions have been running high between Moscow and Brussels over the alleged poisoning of Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny last year. Moscow rejects any involvement, saying that the EU is hyping things to pressure Russia. Political commentator Bill Jones gave us his thoughts on the tense situation between the EU and Russia.
I think the EU decision is a tremendous mistake. There's a lot going on now which is aimed at really getting at Russia, including the so-called sudden discovery of Russian espionage in the Czech Republic. The Bulgarians have jumped on board, and the whole European Union is geared up in this campaign against Russia. I think there are a lot of dissenting voices, however, in Europe, and particularly in Germany, which is not interested in creating a conflict on European soil. But the real question is here in the United States, that if the U.S. Convinces the Europeans or can pressure the Europeans to move against Russia, then it becomes kind of a very difficult situation that can lead to military conflict very easily. And the danger is that people may think that they're moving forward with a lot of leeway before it leads to military conflict, and then suddenly they have crossed a red line which they were unaware of or ignored, and then it becomes a military conflict. And of course, the situation in Ukraine at the moment is the most serious, even though the Russians have withdrawn troops from the border. This is a really flashpoint for a conflict. And if the wrong moves are made and the wrong things are said, this can really set things off. We don't know what that breaking point is going to be. The only thing we can say is that if we don't get off of this course is going to lead to war.
With the onslaught of the coronavirus pandemic last year came an increase in hostility and racial abuse against Asians, and the Chinese community in Britain was no exception. As Saeed Purizar reports, some of the abuse has been leveled against the very people putting their own lives on the line to save others.
The COVID-19 pandemic has led to a sharp rise in racism against Asians, hate crimes against Chinese, East and Southeast Asians, and the horrific Atlanta shootings in the U.S. threw the topic into stark relief. In Britain, too, violence against Asians has become a bigger problem than it already was. According to one statistic, hate crimes against Asians in Britain increased fourfold in the first quarter of last year, a trend that continues to this day.
I was in my eye test appointment, and there was 2 spaces between me and every single people that came. didn't choose to sit next to me.
I feel unsafe when I'm by myself, so I just listen to the music. But some people are still gonna say something when they see Asian people.
Before there were any lockdowns, the Chinese and other ethnic communities had already been suffering abuse as a result of fear and misunderstanding stoked by internet conspiracies. Then came former U.S. President Donald Trump pointing the finger of blame for the pandemic at China. Many of the victims have started telling their stories on social media, where they're receiving increasing attention. Among them, a growing number of Asian healthcare workers, such as this nurse, racially abused by a patient whose very life he was helping save.
Racism does exist in our society. It's mirrored colonialism. Britain has been the largest colonial power, arguably, for the last 200 to 300 years. And an ideology that particularly came with the Victorians has risen to reflect that, one of European supremacy, and particularly British supremacy and white supremacy.
The thought of the UK being unsafe is a sentiment shared by British Asian healthcare workers. Some have thought of moving elsewhere, but have had to stay because of the pandemic-imposed restrictions on travel and immigration.
A disproportional number of them, drawn especially from overseas, who trained overseas, find themselves in subordinate positions within in the NHS. So despite their skill, despite their education, they're less likely to be in substantive consultant positions. They're more likely to be at staff grade, at sub-consultant level, career grade, to find it hard to progress. So there's like a glass ceiling.
The easing or lifting of lockdown measures should ordinarily come as exciting news for many. But for the Asian community in Britain, among them frontline healthcare professionals, the bitter experiences of the past year will continue to impact their lives for years to come. Saeed Puriza, Press, London.
And that is for World News.
A diverse range of programs. Spirituality. Youth. Eastern Tales. Roundtable discussions. Culture. Politics. All produced by IRIB English Radio.
In the limelight. At $778 billion U.S. military expenditure, 4.4% higher in 2020 than in 2019, accounted for 39% of the world total. Despite growing demands made by progressive lawmakers and activists to redirect funds from the Pentagon to impoverished communities nationwide to promote human and environmental flourishing, Biden earlier this month requested an even bigger military budget than the one approved last year. Dear listeners, stay with us for an article in this regard written by Kenny Stansil Ryder. This article is published under a heading, Global Military Spending Grew to Nearly $2 trillion in 2020 despite pandemic. Here's more on that. Despite the coronavirus pandemic, worldwide military spending rose to nearly $2 trillion in 2020, according to an analysis published recently by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Global military expenditure in 2020, estimated to have reached $1.98 trillion, was 2.6% higher than in 2019 and 9.3% higher than in 2011, according to CIPRI's new report. A 2020 bump in military budgets was observed in Africa, that is 5.1%, in Europe, 4%, the Americas, 3.9%, and Asia and Oceania, that is 2.5%. The West Asia region was the only regional exception where there was a 6.5% decrease in military spending in the 11 countries for which data is available. CIPRI researcher Diego Lopes da Silva told AFP that last year's growth in world military expenditure, which coincided with a 4.4% decline in global gross domestic product, was unexpected. Because of the pandemic, one would think military spending would decrease, he said, but it's possible to conclude with some certainty that COVID-19 did not have a significant impact on global military spending. In 2020 at least. Given that military spending continued to escalate during an economic downturn, CIPRI found that the global military burden, or military expenditure, as a share of GDP grew from 2.2% to 2.4%, the largest annual increase since 2009 financial crisis. A substantial percentage of global military spending in 2020 was driven by a handful of countries. According to CIPRI's analysis of the data, 62% of the world's military expenditure was attributable to just 5 countries. When the military budgets of Saudi Arabia, Germany, France, Japan, and South Korea are added to the tally, these 10 countries accounted for $1.48 trillion, or 75% of the world's total military expenditure last year. With a military budget of $778 billion in 2020, the U.S. alone was responsible for 39% of the world's total military expenditure last year. Although other top spenders all increased their military budgets last year, including China, India, Russia, and the UK, the United States continued to lead the surge in militarism, spending 4.4% more in 2020 than in 2019. Alexandra Marksteiner, a researcher at CIPRI, said in a statement that 3 consecutive years of increased U.S. military spending reflects growing concerns over perceived threats from strategic competitors such as China and Russia, as well as the Trump administration's drive to bolster what it saw as a depleted U.S. military. The U.S. spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, according to the Institute's for Policy Studies National Priorities Project. In addition, military spending accounts for more than half of the federal discretionary budget, even as U.S. voters support reallocating a portion of the Pentagon budget to healthcare, education, housing, and renewable energy. CIPRI noted in its report that while military spending rose globally, some countries explicitly reallocated part of their planned military spending to pandemic response, such as Chile and South Korea, which is precisely what U.S. campaigners have been urging President Joe Biden and Congress to do. Despite growing demands made by progressive lawmakers and activists to redirect funds from the Pentagon to impoverished communities nationwide to promote human and environmental flourishing, Biden earlier this month requested an even bigger military budget than the one approved last year. While the White House has been provided with specific proposals for how to slash the Pentagon budget and actually improve national security, Lopes da Silva said the Biden administration has not given any indications that it will reduce military spending. As Carly Town, co-director of the anti-war group Code Pink and coordinator of the Defund the Pentagon campaign, stressed last month, cutting the Pentagon budget and reinvesting in the needs of our communities is not only morally necessary, it's also urgent if we are going to address the biggest threat that faces our planet, that is climate change. The Pentagon is the world's single largest consumer of oil and one of the world's top greenhouse gas emitters, Town added. If we are going to take the future of our planet seriously, we need to cut the Pentagon budget now.
The debate.
In his first speech to Congress, U.S. President Joe Biden said, "We're in a competition with China and other countries to win the 21st century." The U.S. president said he's not seeking to worsen relations with Beijing and called diplomacy the best way to deal with disputes, but also said the U.S. will maintain a strong military presence in the Indo-Pacific. Beijing, for its part, has urged the U.S. to stop an upward trend in its military activities in the air and seas near China, which threatens regional peace. Joe Biden also said his country would stand up to China's unfair trade practices, accusing Beijing of intellectual property theft. Biden has maintained a tough anti-Beijing stance inherited from the previous administration, which also includes more visible support for Taiwan. This has infuriated China, which deems the island as part of its territory. The two countries are also locked in a years-long trade war. Well, joining us on tonight's debate, we have Director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies, Mr. John Pfeffer, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. Also, we have National Security Analyst Brian Downing joining us from Florida. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Pfeffer in Washington, D.C. On Wednesday, Joe Biden said that the U.S. was in a competition with China and other countries to win the 21st century. Please unpack that for us.
Well, the United States has for, a couple of decades identified China as kind of the leading challenger to its international global power in the world. And this has proven to be a kind of focal point for U.S. economic and strategic thinking. In other words, the United States is currently kind of reorienting its military away from the war on terror, the endless wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and toward great power competition, China being perhaps the most important of those competitors. But it's also economic, of course, as China has become, according to several standards, the most powerful economy in the world. And so this is something that the Biden administration, as you have pointed out, has to a certain extent inherited from the Trump administration, but also from the Obama administration as well.
Mr. Downing, in Florida, Biden said that he doesn't want a conflict with the world's second largest economy, but the U.S. will stand up for its fundamental trade rights. China has frequently maintained that a U.S. military presence in the South China Sea, the South China Sea, East China Sea, and Taiwan Strait is the main destabilizing factor in the region. Talk to us about the tensions under the new U.S. administration and who is threatening the stability of the region.
Well, China is the rising economic power. It will be the most powerful economy in the world, and, the estimates vary, but it's going to happen within 10 or 20 years. It's inevitable. And along with that growing sense of power, they want to show it symbolically, and historically one of the most important ways to do that has been through using your military, specifically your Navy, I think. You remember there was a time when the British Navy ranged from Europe through Caribbean, the Suez Canal, the Persian Gulf, Straits of Malacca, Hong Kong, everywhere. And then the United States, 100 years ago, Theodore Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet around the world. It was a symbol that the United States was coming on and that Europe was a declining area. Well, China feels the same way towards the United States and wants to show it symbolically. I don't really think there's that much threat of an overt war between American and Chinese forces, or even a major conflict. Remember, throughout the Cold War with the Soviet Union, we always heard, well, these incidents can get out of hand, and indeed they can. But through all that period, 1945 to 1991, things were pretty much held in check. There were hotlines, there were incidents. American and Russian naval vessels collided in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. So I really think it's a manageable thing. China, to my way of thinking, wants to dominate the world economically, establish its centricity in the world. Dominate might be too strong a word. Remember that in all recorded history, the Chinese economy has been the most powerful one in the world, except for 2 centuries, the 19th century and the 20th century. So to China, the West, the United States, these are historical aberrations that can and will be corrected in the next few decades. So I see it mostly as an economic conflict and not a military one. But as I said, incidents can happen.
Sure. Mr. Pfeffer, the Chinese Defense Ministry urged the United States on Thursday to rein in its frontline forces, which Beijing has said to have become more active in the air and seas near China this year. Why the increase in activity? What is the U.S. worried about?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, often at the beginning of administrations, whether we're talking about the Obama administration, the George W. Bush administration, there's heightened conflict with China initially as the two superpowers get a measure of one another. And often that has given way to a much more pragmatic relationship, to economic negotiations, even to some security negotiations. This time round, the Biden administration comes in at a time when it frankly has to focus on domestic issues. It has to revive the economy, it has to get COVID under control. It is dealing with infrastructure needs. It is decided in large part to characterize those domestic transformations as equally necessary to combat rising China. In other words, we need infrastructure development in the United States to compete effectively with China. At the same time, we're responding to some of the initiatives under the Trump administration to draw together alliances more closely to contain China. This is kind of the flip side of Biden's approach to multilateralism. I mean, there are 2 approaches, obviously. One is to work with other countries to deal with global problems. The second is to work with your allies and some other countries to contain your adversaries. And it's this second type of multilateralism that the Biden administration has continued from the Trump years. For instance, coordinating with the so-called Quad, the United States, Japan, Australia, India, to discuss ways of combating Chinese influence. working more closely with Japan and South Korea in a greater trilateral cooperation, drawing closer with some of our allies around the South China Sea, particularly Vietnam in this case, military allies suddenly after 20 or 30 years of adversarial relations. All of it designed to push back at China and push back at what is perceived as greater assertiveness from the Chinese government, greater nationalism from the Chinese government. And so I think all of this combines to contribute to the United States giving signs through various methods, military methods, that it is not going to be falling back in the Pacific, that it will continue to assert itself as a Pacific power.
Mr. Downing, responding to a question about Biden's speech, a spokesman for China's foreign ministry said the U.S. was merely feeling insecure and jealous about China's development. Those comments were made by Wang Wenbin. He said at a daily briefing that this is in nature, out of Cold War thinking, a zero-sum mindset, an ideological bias, and a sign of lack of confidence. Do you see it in that light as well?
I think there is, over the last few years, a sense of insecurity and resentment in the United States. That's something that just about every American knew for the last 75 years or so, that the United States was the dominant power in the world, is very much in doubt. And there are insecurities, resentments, and anxieties associated with that. But, let's bear in mind that Chinese airplanes fly over Taiwan airspace every day. They may be doing it right now while we're doing this interview. Their ships violate territorial waters of the Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries. So, it's not as though China is just sitting back and building its economy and not doing anything to cause anxieties, fears, and concerns.
Okay, Mr. Pfeffer, China warned the U.S. against meddling in its internal affairs and threatened firm actions against U.S. interference in issues like Hong Kong and, of course, Taiwan, considering the congestion of forces in, above, and below the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea. A conflict could explode by accident or even by design. Is a serious escalation over Taiwan imminent, in your opinion?
Well, I think I would agree with Brian that there's really not an imminent chance of military conflict in the United States and China, but both sides are eager to avoid any kind of significant escalation. As I said, the Biden administration wants to focus on rebuilding the U.S. economy. China, of course, is focused also on not just economic progress within China, recovering obviously from the COVID crisis,